Steve Harvey adjusted his tie one more time as he prepared for another episode of his daytime talk show. The studio lights blazed overhead, and the familiar energy of his crew buzzed around him. For 25 years, Steve had been entertaining audiences, making people laugh and sharing heartwarming stories. He thought he had seen it all. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Steve reviewed his guest list while sipping his coffee. The scheduled guests included a family reunion story, a local hero being honored, and a surprise celebrity appearance that his producers had been mysterious about. When Steve asked who the surprise guest was, his producer simply smiled and said it would be worth the wait. The show began with Steve's usual energy and humor. He welcomed his audience with his signature laugh and moved through the first two segments smoothly. The family reunion brought tears of joy, and the local hero segment filled everyone with pride. But as they prepared for the final segment, Steve noticed something different in the air. His crew seemed more excited than usual, whispering among themselves and glancing toward the backstage area. During the commercial break, Steve's producer approached him with an unusual request. She asked him to sit down for this final segment instead of his typical standing position. She also mentioned that this guest had specifically requested to share something personal with Steve, something that might surprise him. Steve found this odd but trusted his team's judgment. As the cameras rolled again, Steve faced his audience with curiosity building in his chest. He had no idea that in the next few minutes, his life would be touched in a way he never expected. The man walking onto his stage would share words that would reach into his heart and change his perspective on his own journey. The backstage curtain moved, and Steve heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching. His audience began to murmur, with recognition and excitement. Someone very special was about to join him, someone whose words would soon move one of television's toughest hosts to tears. Steve turned toward the entrance, his professional smile ready, completely unaware that he was about to receive one of the most meaningful messages of his entire career. The surprise guest stepped into the light, and Steve's expression shifted from curiosity to genuine amazement. The journey that would unfold over the next several minutes would remind Steve why he fell in love with entertainment in the first place. It would also reveal how his work had touched lives in ways he never knew possible. As the guest walked closer, Steve realized this wasn't going to be just another interview. This was going to be something much more personal and profound. The studio fell quiet as the guest took his seat across from Steve. What happened next would become one of the most talked-about moments in daytime television history. A moment when two men connected over shared experiences of struggle, perseverance, and the power of staying true to one's values despite life's hardships. Keanu Reeves walked onto Steve Harvey's stage with his characteristic humble demeanor. The audience erupted in applause, recognizing the beloved actor immediately. Steve stood up, his surprise genuine and visible. He had expected many things, but seeing Keanu Reeves on his show was not one of them. The two men embraced warmly, and Steve couldn't help but laugh with delight. He had always admired Keanu from afar, knowing him as one of Hollywood's most genuine and kind-hearted people. But Steve had no idea why Keanu was there or what he wanted to share. As they settled into their chairs, Keanu looked directly at Steve with those intense, thoughtful eyes that had captivated audiences for decades. There was something different about his expression today. It wasn't the polished look of a celebrity making a promotional appearance. This was personal. Keanu began by telling Steve how much he respected him, not just as an entertainer but as a person. He spoke about watching Steve's journey from stand-up comedy to hosting game shows, then to his own talk show. But what impressed Keanu most was how Steve had always remained authentic, never losing sight of his values despite fame and success. Steve listened, feeling touched, but also curious about where this conversation was heading. He had interviewed thousands of people, but something about Keanu's presence felt different. There was an emotional weight in the air that Steve couldn't quite identify. Keanu then shared something that surprised everyone in the studio. He revealed that he had been following Steve's career closely, particularly how Steve spoke about his faith, his family, and his commitment to helping others. Keanu explained that Steve's openness about his struggles and his journey to success had been inspiring to him during some of his own difficult times. The audience was captivated, watching two successful men have what felt like a deeply personal conversation. Steve found himself leaning forward, drawn in by Keanu's sincerity. He realized this wasn't going to be a typical celebrity interview about movies or projects. This was something much more meaningful. Keanu paused for a moment, collecting his thoughts. He looked around the studio, taking in the faces of the audience, then turned back to Steve. What he was about to share would explain why he had specifically requested to appear on this show, and why this message was so important to him. The studio remained quiet, everyone sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Steve felt a flutter in his chest, an unusual nervousness that he rarely experienced after decades in television. He had no idea that Keanu was about to share a story that would connect them in ways neither had expected. Keanu's next words would reveal a side of both men that the public rarely saw, showing how two very different paths in entertainment had led to similar life lessons and shared values that neither had fully realized until this moment. Keanu took a deep breath and began to share something he had never spoken about publicly before. He told Steve about a particularly dark period in his life years ago, when he was struggling with personal losses and questioning his purpose. During that time, he found himself watching television late at night, unable to sleep, feeling disconnected from the world around him. He explained how one night, channel surfing through the darkness of his living room, he stumbled across one of Steve's stand-up comedy specials. At first, he was just looking for a distraction, something to fill the empty hours. But as he listened to Steve talk about his own struggles, his journey from being homeless to finding success, something shifted inside him. Steve's eyes widened as Keanu continued. The actor described how Steve's honesty about his failures and his faith had struck a chord with him. Here was someone who had faced real hardship, who had been knocked down repeatedly, but who never gave up on his dreams or his belief in something greater than himself. Keanu shared how he had started recording Steve's shows, watching them whenever he felt overwhelmed by life's challenges. Steve's message about persistence, about treating people with kindness regardless of your circumstances, and about staying grateful for what you have, became a source of strength for Keanu during his darkest moments. The audience was completely silent now, absorbed in this intimate revelation. Steve felt his throat tighten as he realized the impact his words had unknowingly had on someone he deeply respected. He had always hoped his message would reach people, but hearing it from Keanu made it feel more real than ever. Keanu went on to explain how Steve's approach to life had influenced some of his own choices. The way Steve treated his crew, his generosity with struggling comedians, his commitment to his family despite his busy schedule. These were things that Keanu had observed and tried to incorporate into his own life. Steve found himself fighting back emotions as Keanu described specific moments from Steve's career that had meant something to him. Times when Steve had spoken about loss, about the importance of lifting others up, about finding purpose beyond personal success. These weren't just entertainment moments for Keanu. They were life lessons that had helped shape his path forward. The actor paused, his own emotions visible now. He looked directly at Steve and said something that would stay with the host forever. He thanked Steve for being real in a world full of pretense, for showing that success doesn't have to change your character, and for proving that entertainment could be a force for good in people's lives. Steve felt tears forming in his eyes, something that rarely happened to him on camera. He was used to being the one offering encouragement and wisdom to others, but here was someone he admired telling him that his journey had mattered in ways he never knew. The weight of responsibility and gratitude was overwhelming. Keanu leaned forward, his voice becoming even more tender as he continued. He told Steve about a specific night, about 3 years ago, when he was dealing with the anniversary of a personal loss. He had been sitting alone in his house, feeling the weight of grief and wondering if anything he did really mattered in the grand scheme of life. That night, he had turned on an episode of Steve's show where Steve was talking to a young man who had lost his father. Keanu watched as Steve shared his own experience of losing his father at a young age, how that loss had shaped him, but not broken him. Steve spoke about how pain could either make you bitter or make you more compassionate toward others who were hurting. Keanu's voice caught slightly as he described how those words had reached him exactly when he needed to hear them. He realized that his own losses, his own struggles didn't have to be just personal pain. They could become sources of empathy and connection with others who were suffering. Steve listened intently, his professional composure beginning to crack as he saw the genuine emotion in Keanu's eyes. The actor continued, explaining how that moment had changed his approach to his work and his interactions with people. Instead of hiding from his experiences, he had started using them to connect more deeply with his roles and with the people he met. Keanu then shared something that brought gasps from the audience. He revealed that he had started a private foundation, inspired partly by Steve's example of giving back, that helped people dealing with grief and loss. He had been funding counseling services and support groups, but had kept it completely anonymous because he believed in doing good without seeking recognition. The actor explained that watching Steve's genuine care for people, the way he used his platform to lift others up rather than just promote himself, had shown him a different way to approach success. Steve's example had taught him that true wealth came from what you gave away, not what you accumulated. Steve felt overwhelmed by the realization that his words had not only comforted Keanu during difficult times, but had inspired him to help countless others. The ripple effect of one person's authenticity was spreading far beyond what Steve had ever imagined possible. Keanu paused and looked directly into Steve's eyes. What he said next would be the moment that finally broke through Steve's emotional barriers completely. He thanked Steve for showing him that it was possible to be successful while still being human, still being vulnerable, and still caring more about others than about your own image. The studio was completely quiet except for the occasional sniffle from audience members who were also moved by this unexpected display of raw honesty between two public figures. Steve felt his chest tighten as he realized that his life's work had touched someone in ways he had never dreamed possible. Keanu reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn piece of paper. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it, and Steve could see that it was covered in handwriting. The actor explained that he had written this letter to Steve years ago but had never had the courage to send it. He began to read aloud, his voice steady but filled with emotion. The letter detailed specific moments from Steve's career that had impacted Keanu's life. Times when Steve had spoken about overcoming homelessness, about maintaining faith when everything seemed hopeless, about the importance of treating every person with dignity regardless of their station in life. As Keanu read, Steve felt tears beginning to flow down his cheeks. The letter described how Steve's willingness to share his failures along with his successes had given Keanu permission to be imperfect, to make mistakes, and to keep trying anyway. It spoke about how Steve's laughter in the face of adversity had taught Keanu that joy was a choice, not just a circumstance. The most powerful part of the letter came when Keanu read about how Steve's relationship with his children had inspired him. Keanu had watched interviews where Steve talked about being present for his kids despite his busy schedule, about teaching them values over just giving them things. This had influenced Keanu's own approach to the young people in his life, showing him that success meant nothing if you couldn't share it with the people you loved. Keanu folded the letter carefully and looked up at Steve, who was now openly crying. The tough, experienced television host who had seen everything was reduced to tears by the simple honesty of someone telling him that his life had made a difference. But Keanu wasn't finished. He stood up and walked over to Steve, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. In a voice that was barely above a whisper, he told Steve that he wanted him to know something that might be hard to hear, but was important to understand. He explained that Steve's impact went far beyond entertainment or even inspiration. Through his authenticity and his commitment to his values, Steve had literally saved lives. The actor revealed that he personally knew of people who had decided not to give up on their dreams, not to give up on themselves, because they had heard Steve's story and realized that their current circumstances didn't define their future possibilities. Steve looked up at Keanu through his tears, overwhelmed by the weight of responsibility and gratitude. He had always hoped his work mattered, but hearing it described this way made him understand that every word he spoke on television carried more power than he had realized. Keanu sat back down and delivered his final message. He told Steve that, in a world full of people trying to be famous, Steve had chosen to be meaningful. In an industry that often rewarded selfishness, Steve had consistently chosen generosity, and in a culture that celebrated being tough, Steve had had the courage to be vulnerable. As Keanu finished speaking, the studio remained in complete silence for several moments. Steve sat with his head in his hands, overwhelmed by the unexpected gift of knowing that his life's work had touched someone so deeply. When he finally looked up, his face was streaked with tears, but his eyes were bright with a joy and purpose he hadn't felt in years. The audience began to applaud, but it wasn't the usual enthusiastic clapping of a television show. This was something deeper, more respectful, acknowledging that they had witnessed something rare and genuine. Many audience members were crying themselves, moved by the raw honesty they had just experienced. Steve stood up and embraced Keanu, holding him tightly as he whispered words of gratitude that the cameras couldn't pick up. When they separated, Steve looked out at his audience, and then back at Keanu with a smile that seemed to come from his soul. He told Keanu, and everyone watching, that this conversation had reminded him why he fell in love with entertainment in the first place. It wasn't about the fame or the money or even the laughter, though those things were wonderful. It was about the connection between human beings, the opportunity to share stories and experiences that reminded people they weren't alone in their struggles. Steve shared that he had been feeling tired lately, questioning whether his work still mattered in a world that seemed increasingly divided and negative. Keanu's words had renewed his sense of purpose and reminded him that every person who chose to be authentic and kind was making the world a little bit better. The show ended with both men standing together, looking out at the audience with genuine warmth and gratitude. As the credits rolled, neither man moved to leave the stage immediately. They continued talking quietly, two successful people who had found an unexpected connection through their shared commitment to using their platforms for good. After the show ended, Steve and Keanu spent another hour talking privately. They discovered they had more in common than either had realized, both having faced personal losses, both struggling with the responsibility of public life, and both committed to making their success meaningful by helping others. The episode became one of the most watched and most shared segments in the show's history. Viewers responded to the authenticity of the moment, sharing their own stories of how Steve's words had impacted their lives. The comment sections filled with gratitude from people who had been inspired by both men's willingness to be vulnerable and real. Months later, Steve would say that this conversation with Keanu changed how he approached his work. He became even more intentional about sharing meaningful content, more focused on the impact of his words rather than just the entertainment value. Keanu's message had reminded him that television could be more than just a medium for laughs. It could be a force for hope, connection, and positive change in people's lives. The friendship that began that day continued to grow, with both men supporting each other's charitable efforts and occasionally collaborating on projects that reflected their shared values. Their unexpected connection became a testament to the power of authentic human connection and the lasting impact of choosing kindness and vulnerability over image and pretense.